In the darkest chapters of human cruelty, certain punishments stand out as so savage that even seasoned historians have struggled to grasp their existence. One such method took an ordinary wooden beam and turned it into a device of unthinkable torment. It was known as riding the rail. For those forced to endure it, death would have felt like mercy. This is not just a story of bodily agony, it is a stark glimpse into the blackest corners of human invention when granted the authority to punish. What you are about to hear may unsettle you deeply, yet it is a tale that must be told. Only by facing our capacity for such evil can we hope to keep it from rising again. The year is 1863. The American Civil War tears the nation apart. Near Petersburg, Virginia, inside a Union camp, a soldier accused of desertion is hauled before his officers. His punishment will not be a quick firing squad or simple confinement. Instead, he is sentenced to something infinitely crueler, a torment that will leave him pleading for the death he was originally spared. Before the eyes of his compelled comrades, rough hands hoist him onto a narrow wooden rail no wider than a typical fence post. Within minutes his screams rip through the dawn air, cries that would haunt every man present for the rest of their days. Yet Civil War camps were hardly the origin of this horror. Forcing victims to straddle sharpened wooden beams stretches back across centuries of war and judicial cruelty. In medieval Europe, suspected witches were made to sit astride sharp-edged wooden triangles as a supposed test of supernatural power. The Spanish Inquisition perfected the method, hanging weights from victims' ankles to drive the edge deeper into flesh and bone. In colonial and frontier America, the practice was reborn as mob justice in places where law barely existed. The mechanics were brutally simple, but the damage to the human body was devastatingly intricate. The victim was raised onto a narrow beam, often a fence rail or a purpose-built sawhorse whose top had been sharpened to a vicious edge. Most rails measured between 2 and 4 inches wide at the crest, narrowing to as little as half an inch. The entire weight of the body rested solely on that cruel line, pressing directly into the perineum and inner thighs. Almost instantly, circulation to the lower limbs began to fail while nerves and vessels were crushed. The height of the rail was carefully chosen, high enough that only by standing painfully on tiptoe could any pressure be relieved. Victims faced an impossible dilemma: bear their full weight on the edge or exhaust their legs trying to rise. Often their hands were bound behind their backs or overhead, removing any chance of using arms for support. In the worst cases, weights were added to the ankles, hour by hour, pulling the body downward with ever-increasing force. The cruelest version saw the rail coated in salt or turpentine that burned its way into opening wounds. The injuries unfolded in a grim, predictable sequence that contemporary doctors recorded with chilling detachment. First came deep bruising and swelling as blood vessels ruptured. Within an hour the skin split open, creating long, gaping lacerations along the contact line. Numbness crept into the legs as nerves died and circulation collapsed. After several hours, tissue began to necrotize, causing permanent destruction of muscle and internal organs. Many men passed out repeatedly, only to be revived with buckets of cold water and forced back onto the rail. The body's very resilience became its curse. Modern medicine now makes clear the full extent of the ruin. The pudendal nerve, which governs sensation and function in the pelvic area, suffered irreversible compression, leaving survivors incontinent, impotent, and in lifelong agony. Femoral arteries and veins were crushed, triggering blood clots that could kill weeks later through pulmonary embolism. Doctors today recognize compartment syndrome, rhabdomyolysis, and profound psychological trauma identical to that seen in modern torture survivors. The humiliation was deliberate and total. Victims were often stripped naked or nearly so, their dignity shredded alongside their flesh. The slow, public nature of the destruction ensured they remained conscious, fully aware of their own disintegration. Men begged for death, offering anything, everything, if someone would only end it. Their weakening cries hung over camps and towns like a plague of dread. During the Civil War the practice became systematic, used by both Union and Confederate forces, though most common in raw volunteer units where discipline was hardest to enforce. Official regulations banned it, but enforcement depended entirely on the conscience, or lack thereof, of distant commanders. Union soldier James Madison Stone wrote in his memoirs of witnessing the punishment at Camp Chase, Ohio, "Even the hardest men wept openly, and several fainted from sheer horror." New immigrants, especially Irish and Germans, were punished disproportionately, often for offenses that earned native-born soldiers only a reprimand. Troublemakers and those who dared question authority were favorite targets. In Confederate camps, captured black Union soldiers and poor white deserters faced the rail most often. Military surgeons left meticulous records. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, medical director of the Army of the Potomac, treated men who needed months of care after only a few hours on the rail. Many never walked normally again, crippled by chronic pain and permanent nerve damage. Others descended into what we now call PTSD. Some became ghosts within their units, others violently unhinged. Caring for these broken men eventually became a burden commanders could no longer ignore. A soldier who might have been reclaimed with milder discipline was instead turned into a permanent invalid. By late 1864, generals like William Tecumseh Sherman began court-martialing officers who authorized the practice, declaring such barbarism had no place in a civilized army. Survivor testimony is the most harrowing of all. Private Michael O'Sullivan of the 69th New York endured 4 hours for alleged theft. He told a military commission the pain began sharp, then became something indescribable, as though my very soul was being torn in two. He walked on crutches the rest of his life and died young from recurring infections in the scar tissue. Women were not spared. On the frontier, those accused of prostitution or adultery sometimes suffered modified versions designed to maximize sexual humiliation and gynecological injury. Shame kept most silent, many never sought help and died slowly of sepsis. The practice crossed oceans and centuries. Tsarist Russia had its mare, Imperial Japan used splintering bamboo, Belgian Congo administrators forced entire families to watch rubber quota violators destroyed on rails. The same dark ingenuity appears again and again, wherever power feels free to invent suffering. After the Civil War, as federal troops withdrew from the South, the rail became a weapon of night-riding terror. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups used it to break black political leaders and cow communities into submission. Its terrifying simplicity, any fence could become the instrument, made it perfect for hit-and-run intimidation. Black Mississippi legislator Samuel Johnson was dragged from his home in 1871 and held on a rail for 2 hours until he agreed to resign his seat. He survived, permanently crippled, and testified before Congress, but federal protection never came. In the industrial North, Company guards and Pinkerton agents used it on Union organizers during the 1877 railroad strikes. Western mining camps delivered vigilante justice on rails to claim jumpers and thieves. The phrase, "ridden out of town on a rail," entered the language, stripped of its blood-soaked truth. Foreign observers were appalled. British war correspondent William Howard Russell wrote that scenes in the American South rivaled anything he had seen in Crimea or India. French diplomats called it a glaring contradiction in a nation that claimed to be the world's beacon of liberty. Yet American courts rarely prosecuted. Juries drawn from the same communities refused to convict. The law, in practice, protected the torturers. Religious voices split. Some preachers quoted Old Testament vengeance to justify it, while Quakers, Methodists, and black clergy like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner condemned it as blasphemy against the image of God. As germ theory spread, doctors realized many who survived the rail itself later died of infection from filthy wounds. That medical testimony, combined with economic arguments, maimed workers were expensive, finally began to turn the tide. The replacement of wooden fences with barbed wire quietly removed the ready instrument from the landscape. Urban-ured police forces replaced mob rule. Photography made denial harder. By the early 20th century, rail riding had largely vanished from open practice, though whispers persisted in isolated corners. Its memory was then carefully sanitized. Today, "ridden out of town on a rail" is a cartoon phrase for political embarrassment, the screams behind it long erased. The victims carried invisible wounds that echoed through generations: chronic pain, sexual dysfunction, shattered families. Cultures taught that extreme violence was normal. Their suffering helped widen the definition of cruel and unusual punishment, informed early trauma care, and laid groundwork for human rights law, but justice came too late for thousands. The story of riding the rail forces us to look straight at what ordinary people are capable of when law fails, when dehumanization is permitted, when cruelty is called discipline. Progress away from such darkness is never guaranteed, it must be guarded with relentless vigilance. In remembering the agony of those who were broken on the rail, we renew our promise, never again, not on our watch.